Animals have been surprisingly present in reflecting on wisdom in European literary and philosophical traditions, as well as in the arts. It has been common to refer to animals as symbols of wisdom. Birds, and especially the owl, take on particular prominence here, of course, and I think maybe half of the philosophy departments in the world use the owl as its symbol. The owl accompanies the goddess of wisdom, Athena in Greece, and her syncretic incarnation, Minerva, in Roman mythology. Athena and the owl were imprinted on ancient coins, such as the Athenian tetradrachm, which we see here at the bottom, which is also referred to as glauks, or little owl. Scholars are uncertain why owls figure so prominently as symbols of wisdom and as always being alongside both Athena and Minerva. In my view, it is too simplistic to argue, as some scholars have done, that the abundance of owls as symbols of wisdom is due to the fact that Athens, and especially the area of the Parthenon devoted to worshiping Athena, was home to many owls. As the goddess of wisdom, Athena is usually portrayed as bright-eyed, glaukopis, to symbolize her wisdom and power of vision. And here we already see a kind of affinity or parallel between the way that Athena looks like and the way that owls see. Similarly, the most striking feature of the owl is its large, dark eyes. Interestingly, while most birds have the eyes located on the side of their head, the owl's eyes, like that of humans, face forward. Could it be the case that the owl appeals to us because its perceptive looks are both mesmerizing in their familiarity and also in their animal otherness or foreignness? In contrast to humans, owls' eyes are more static, of course, and this lends to their attraction. Also, owls have the capacity to turn or twist their head for up to 270 degrees, which practically allows them not only to look behind, but also to look to the left by turning to the right, and vice versa. I'm not going to try to illustrate this here, because this is where the parallel between owls and human beings ends. As is well documented in classical works such as Aesop's Fables and Aristophanes' comedy The Birds, owls and other animals have captivated the philosophical imagination as well as the literary imagination. Scholars have argued that animals inhabit Aesop's fables because they were meant to be used to teach children important lessons for life for many generations. I think they're also quite popular here in Japan, some of these fables. According to this view, the animal presentations are simply anthropomorphized depictions of certain human characteristics. For example, the fox is cunning, the lion is brave, the sheep is timid, and so on. Animal representations might allow easier identification for the children for whom many of these stories were written. However, this is, in my opinion, not a sufficient explanation for the abundant presence of animals in wisdom literature. Going back to our topic, we may say that Aesop's fables use animal characteristics in order to put the human perspective into perspective. Often this happens with a humorous or morbid twist that allows for a decoupling and a stepping back from our ordinary human perspective. Not rarely are the animals talking, which is already funny by itself, to have speaking animals. To take an example, in the fable The Owl and the Birds, which is recounted by, among others, Aesop and La Fontaine, so from classical Greek antiquity to the 17th century European literature, the owl tries to warn other bird species. In some versions of the fable, and this here is an interesting representation from the end of the 19th century by Kawanabe Kyosui, in an edition of Fontaine's version in which this fable is also included about the owl and telling the other birds. In some version of the fable, the other birds are eagles. They are being warned by the owl about different kinds of danger. The owl warns other birds against natural as well as human traps and instructs the other birds how to avoid or diffuse these dangers early on. Of course, the other birds think that the owl is crazy and refuse to listen. When the owl itself, a predator bird, sees a man with a bow, it warns the other birds, quote, "This man will outstrip you with the help of your own feathers. For though he's on foot himself, he will send feathered shafts after you." So the feathered shafts are, of course, being made out of dead birds. And so it's the feathers themselves that allow the walking human person to shoot the birds. Again, the other birds do not listen. When they do learn to take seriously the owl's warnings, it is too late. When the owl is finally being recognized for its wisdom and foresight by other birds, it gives up providing advice and only complains from now on. It becomes a lamenting owl. The saying, "The eagle who is shot by his own feathers," advanced to become a commonly cited proverb. It suggests that one has been defeated by one's own means, and often due to one's own pride, preventing one from listening to valuable advice. The other day, I noticed that when one climbs up on Mount Daimonji, we also find a very interesting and also peculiar presentation of owl as a form of police owl or fire owl, you might call it. And this is a very interesting representation, I thought, because the owl warns humans not to smoke and thereby not to cause forest fires. And as a very strict owl, it seems also to be rather funny. The owl is warning or policing humans. At the same time, the owl is an endangered species that is threatened by those it is warning. So we have this interesting circularity here. Returning to our topic, birds of wisdom appear throughout classical literature, probably also because people then were living much closer to nature than we are nowadays. Another example I would like to go to is Aristophanes' already mentioned comedy, The Birds, not to be confused with the Hitchcock movie, of course. The birds construct a city by the name of Cloud Cuckoo Land, a bird utopia that promises an escape from the harm caused by human beings. This safe haven also provides refuge for some Athenian citizens escaping from the endless boredom of philosophical and political debates about laws and wars and other matters that are considered important in Athens at the time. The birds do not claim to possess wisdom, but instead they muse upon eternal wisdom. As in the case of Aesop's fable, the comedy draws on birds to bring about a shift in human perspective. They mock the inherited religious and mythical knowledge and the tendency of humans to take their pursuits of wisdom all too seriously. Aristophanes is known to ridicule the presence of philosophical claims to wisdom in his plays, most famously the caricature of Socrates that we find in the comedy The Clouds. In contrast to human cosmologies, the origin of the bird universe, we learn from the talking birds, is to be found in an egg. And the birds born from love are superior to the unreliable and all too human and constantly fighting Olympian gods that the birds are presented as an alternative to. The birds are fully aware of the advantage of having wings, and in a kind of satirical tone of voice, the birds' chorus invites the human audience to engage in a thought experiment, a form of imagined role play or interspecies swap. And there the owls say, no, this I didn't put on, only fancy, dear spectators, had you each a brace of wings, never need you tired and hungry, add a tragic chorus stay, you would lightly, when it bored you, spread your wings and fly away, back returning after lunch to enjoy your comic play. So human beings are invited by the birds to imagine what it would be like to be as free as a bird. The thought of flying away whenever bored or hungry clearly seems appealing. The philosophical fascination with birds extends into modern times and has given rise to a debate about how to explain and interpret avian vocalization or bird song or bird speech in parrots and other birds. In his Critique of Judgment, the philosopher Immanuel Kant writes that many birds, including the parrot, the hummingbird, the bird of paradise, are free beauties themselves. We like them freely and on their own account. He continues, birdsong, which we cannot bring under any rule of music, seems to contain more freedom and hence to offer more to taste than human song, even when this human song is performed according to all the rules of the art of music, because we tire much sooner of a human song if it is repeated often and for long periods. So for Kant, human appreciation of natural beauty exceeds that of the appreciation of art beauty. And thus, writes Kant, when birdsong is imitated very precisely by a human being, as it's sometimes done with a nightingale's warble, it strikes our ears as quite tasteless. So imitated bird song does not really appeal to human beings. And when they find out that what they consider to be real bird song is in fact only either recorded or imitated by human beings, they are quite disappointed. Why does the bird song usually not annoy us, on the other hand? Kant states, a bird song proclaims his joyfulness and contentment with his existence, and further specifies, at least that is how we interpret nature, whether or not it has such an intention. End of quote. The interest in natural instances of, quote, free beauties themselves is higher than the importance humans attach to artificial objects, which might please our vanity and interest in decoration, but do not allow us to rejoice in the very existence of freedom in nature. Kant introduces a thought example to underscore our preference for natural over artificial music. When human beings parrot avian music, the result is, when being discovered, disappointing to the listener. We might add that when parrots speak, or to excuse the metaphor, ape human beings, the result is rather amusing on the other hand. What is important for Kant, though, is that the gap between humans and birds, between reason and nature, cannot be bridged. Even though some form of communication, or perhaps better, a sense of resonance with nature, is not only possible but inherently enjoyable. However, as Kant always makes clear, as long as we remain aware that we listen to the birds, but we do not listen as the birds listen, just as our singing is not at its most artistic when it resembles birdsong. One important difference is that whereas artistic creation and arguably also aesthetic appreciation requires long processes of discipline and cultivation, for humans, at least the appearance of effortless virtuosities that we perceive in animal behavior is only achieved after extensive periods of sustained and dedicated effort, while for birds it appears to arise naturally. Works of art appear as if natural, but are not natural. Effortless beauty without prior training is, if at all, left to the birds. In the history of Western philosophy, animals surface again and again, often in pivotal passages of classical text, where one would least expect them. This is perhaps most obvious in post-Kantian philosophy, especially in Hegel, who has for modern times made the owl of Minerva once again so famous. In the opening chapter of the Phenomenology of Spirit, dedicated to sense certainty, Hegel speaks of animal wisdom. This section is usually read, especially in Anglo-American circles, as an epistemological section in which Hegel refutes the view that sense experience can be adequately captured by way of language, as if our knowledge of the external world would be independent of one's practical engagement with this world. The reference to animal wisdoms are too often overlooked or dismissed as idiosyncratic asides that don't add anything to Hegel's arguments. And yet they are essential and find echoes in later parts of the text dedicated to the spiritual zoo or the spiritual animal kingdom, geistiges Tierreich, in which Hegel presents humans behaving like animals and vice versa, as if in an interspecies carnival. In the chapter on sense certainty, Hegel attributes animals with a sense of practical wisdom that is lost when adopting an overly abstract epistemology. In contrast to naive epistemological conceptions of claiming certainty about sense objects independent of our experience of them, animals have an immediate knowledge and practical grasp of the external world. Animals are not shut out from this wisdom, but on the contrary, show themselves to be most profoundly initiated into it. For they do not just stand idly in front of sensuous things, as if these possessed intrinsic being, but despairing of their reality and completely assured of their nothingness, they fall to without ceremony and eat them up. And all nature, like the animals, celebrates these open mysteries which teach the truth about sensuous things. Here's the quote. It is animals who, in devouring external objects as food, mock sense data epistemologists. They show that the proof of the pudding is not in epistemology, but in the eating. Animals prey, and digestion reveals a better understanding of the open mysteries that bread is not just bread and wine not just wine, but also nourishment, without a need for either special ceremonies or a fancy epistemology to prove this. Animals are not only introduced as examples of practical wisdom defying epistemology. One animal stands particularly for philosophical wisdom and can be considered perhaps Hegel's most semantically laden metaphor. Hegel's image of the owl of Minerva has been the topic of much discussion over generations of interpreters. Here is the quotation from the preface to the lectures on the philosophy of right, in which the metaphorical owl, the ancient company of the goddess of wisdom, but also of death and the arts, accompanies Athena, or in Roman times, as we already said, Minerva. When philosophy paints its gray in gray, one form of life has become old, and by means of gray, it cannot be rejuvenated, but only known. The owl of Minerva takes its flight only when the shades of night are gathering. So the owl metaphor seems to suggest that philosophical wisdom always comes too late on the scene. And there's a lengthy philosophical debate what Hegel exactly meant by this passage, and I will not have sufficient time to go through this. Also the different metaphors that he appeals to, like the gray and gray directly refers to the green and green that Goethe uses to characterize life. So I will not have time to go into the details, only it is interesting to notice that this metaphor has been so prominent of a reference point in many post-Hegelian thinkers. So, for example, it was Hegel's philosophical adversary, Schopenhauer, who radically reverses the image of the owl of Minerva. In contrast to Hegel, for Schopenhauer, the owl is not the bird of wisdom, rather it is a threat to the power of truth. The owl thrives in the darkness and lives off the refractive light of the moon rather than direct light from the sun. It is an emblem of the contagious force of error. And he writes, Schopenhauer writes, every error has a poison inside it. There are no harmless errors, and still less any worthy of reverence, any holy errors. Errors can indeed play its games in the night just as owls or bats do. Nevertheless, it is more likely that these owls and bats will chase the sun back into the east than that a truth once recognized and clearly and completely expressed could be driven back so that some past error could once again occupy its broad seat. And so the metaphor continues. Interestingly, here he already uses the image of the east and the west, and so this is a good transition because he argues that it's more likely that we find a different notion of wisdom in the east. Of course, Schopenhauer is known for his interpretation of Buddhism. Here's another way how this owl metaphor has been taken up in contemporary or modern philosophy. Here we have the 20th century systems theorist Niklas Luhmann, philosopher and sociologist, who in an also humorous way here says, "We can now encourage the owl of Minerva to stop hooting in the corner and begin its flight into the night. Luckily, we have instruments to watch over it, and we know that its journey is a reconnaissance, a Wiedererkennen of modern society." So here, interestingly, systems theory lets the owl fly, but it's also equipped with the right kind of technology in order to make sure that the course of the owl is correct and observed correct, which is the most important for Luhmann. So, interestingly, thus far we have only considered in an all too hazardous manner perhaps references to birds in the European tradition. It is surprising that birds are particularly prominent in the attempts to elucidate wisdom across different cultural traditions, though. A philosophical ornithology would need to trace the attraction that birds have had in the human imagination across cultural boundaries. Birds of wisdom, as well as other wisdom animal depictions, are prominent in all world civilizations. To illustrate this claim and to live up to the promise made in the subtitle of the talk, let me at least briefly mention a few examples from the Taoist classic, the Zhuangzi. So classical Chinese texts are extremely rich in animal imagery, and animals do play an important role when it comes to reflecting about wisdom, including reflecting about the limits of the philosophical pursuit of wisdom. The Zhuangzi alone mentions some 75 animals, including various mythological and hybrid animals. It is striking that the opening chapter starts with a transformation from the giant fish Kun to the phoenix Pang, which is, I did read, even though I have been maybe corrected by Abe Sensei, which is supposed to be similar to a Japanese mythological creature, and I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's written Hai Ryu. And more famous or maybe better known as Tobitatsu. So the Tobitatsu, which is a Nara or a dragon bird, is very similar in many respects to this bird Pang that we find there, and also has this transformative power. Apparently some 50 kilometers from campus at the sea Okishima, there lives one version of it, namely the Ogoncho bird, which every 50 years rises out of the sea. And interestingly, in Japanese mythology, this seems to be not so much a bird of wisdom that one turns to in admiration and appreciation, but apparently it has a horrible scream that one doesn't want to come across. So this is an interesting transformation of mythical creature. The giant bird Pang has played an analogous role to the metaphor of the owl of Minerva in depicting the Taoist ideal of wisdom or great knowledge, which is not or only too well understood by the laughing cicada, and the dove, who consider the excessive dimensions and the flight distance of Peng to be ludicrous when compared to their comparative small domains of flight. We encounter a number of other prominent birds and flying insects, such as the magpie and the famous butterfly. One can distinguish at least 4 modes, I think, in which animals are depicted to make a point about wisdom in the Zhuangzi.